The deadliest killer in Japanese history was not human. In the winter of 1915, in a remote pioneer valley in northern Hokkaido, a small farming settlement was terrorized for 6 days by a single enormous brown bear. 7 people died, 8 if you count the unborn child. It remains, to this day, the worst wild animal attack ever recorded in Japan. But the numbers alone are not why this story has haunted Japan for over a century. It is the way it happened. The bear did not simply attack and vanish. It came back. It learned. It returned to the same houses night after night. And in the most chilling moment of all, it walked into a funeral, the funeral of its own victim. This is the story of a frontier village at the edge of the wilderness, of the starving giant the settlers came to call Kesagake, and of the old hunter who finally brought it down with 2 bullets in the snow. This is the Sankebetsu brown bear incident. To understand what happened in December 1915, you have to understand where it happened. Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, was still a frontier. For most of Japan's history, it had been the land of the indigenous Ainu people, a vast wilderness of forest and snow. Only in the late 1800s did the government begin sending settlers north in large numbers, carving farms out of virgin forest. Sankebetsu was one of those places, a scattering of homesteads in the hills of Tomomai, about 11 kilometers inland from the coast. Its innermost hamlet, a cluster of cabins along a creek called Rokusensawa, had existed barely a decade. Life there was hard and primitive. Families lived in cabins of logs and bark, sealed with straw mats. Heat came from an open hearth. Light came from a single oil lamp. The nearest real town was a day away. There were no telephones and almost no guns. And beyond the tree line lived the Ezo brown bear, the largest land animal in Japan. A big male can weigh over 300 kilograms and stand taller than any man. Most bears avoid people. In a normal year, a bear spends the deep winter asleep in its den. But hunters in Hokkaido had a special name for the exception: Ana Motadzu, the one without a den. A bear that fails to fatten up before winter cannot hibernate. It walks the snow, starving, growing more desperate with every passing day. In November 1915, such a bear came down from the mountains towards the cabins of Rokusensawa. The settlers did not know it yet, but winter had sent them a predator with nothing left to lose. The first visits seemed almost harmless. In mid-November, a huge bear appeared at a farm in the valley, frightening a horse and stealing harvested corn. It came back days later. The settlers organized a watch. On November 30th, 2 local hunters finally got a shot at it. They hit it, or believed they did, but a snowstorm swallowed the trail, and the pursuit was abandoned. What the settlers told themselves next would prove fatal. A wounded bear, the old wisdom said, fears man and never returns. They went back to their winter routines. 9 days later, on December 9th, the bear entered the home of a farmer named Ota Saburo. The farmer was away. Inside was his common-law wife, Abe Mayu, in her early 30s, and a 6-year-old boy the family was fostering, Hasumi Mikio. The bear killed the boy with a single blow. Then it turned on Mayu. She fought. She threw firewood, anything within reach, but the animal caught her and dragged her out of the cabin and into the forest. When neighbors reached the house, they found it wrecked and blood-stained, and Mayu was gone. The next morning, a search party of about 30 men followed the drag marks into the trees. Beneath a fir, buried in the snow, they found what remained of her. The bear had fed, and little was left. The men understood something that made their blood run cold. A bear buries leftover prey to guard it. It does not abandon a cache. It was not finished. It was coming back.
That evening, December 10th, the settlers gathered at the Ota house for Mayu's wake. Candles burned beside the coffin. The men had brought what few weapons they owned. Outside, the temperature dropped and the snow lay deep. At around 8:30, the wall itself seemed to burst open. The bear crashed into the room where the mourners knelt. Men shouted, lamps scattered, and the funeral collapsed into chaos as everyone fled into the dark. By fortune alone, no one died in that intrusion. But the animal was not done with the valley that night. A few hundred meters away stood the farmhouse of the Miyoke family. Because the men were out standing guard, the house had become a shelter. Roughly 10 women and children were gathered inside around the hearth. Minutes after the wake was destroyed, the bear reached their door. It forced its way in. In the panic, a cooking pot overturned onto the fire, and the single oil lamp went out. What followed happened in almost total darkness. The bear moved through the room, striping at whoever it found. Miyoke Kinzo, 3 years old, was killed. So was Saito Haruyoshi, also 3. So was Saito Iwao, 6. And then there was Saito Take. She was heavily pregnant, days from giving birth. The chronicler, who later interviewed the survivors, preserved her final words. Cornered in the dark, she begged the animal to take her life, but to spare the child she carried. Neither was spared. When rescuers finally reached the house, the survivors crawled out from under overturned mats and furniture. A mother, Miyoke Yayo, had been badly wounded protecting her children. Her infant son, Umekichi, had been bitten while strapped to her back. He would survive that night, but die of his wounds 2 years and 8 months later, the incident's 7th victim. In a single evening, one animal had attacked 2 houses and left a community shattered. The survivors abandoned their homes and crowded into the tiny branch school downstream, turning it into a refuge and a fortress. Around the stove, farmers who had lost their families sat in silence, listening to the dark. The valley now belonged to the bear. Word of the massacre traveled down the valley and did not stop. Within days, the response had grown into one of the largest animal hunts in Japanese history. Police came from the district, firefighting brigades and youth associations mobilized. Even army infantry were arranged for the operation. Over the course of the hunt, roughly 600 men, 60 guns, and packs of hunting dogs would be committed against a single animal. And still, the bear outmaneuvered them. The hunters knew one thing about their enemy: it returned to its kills. So they set a trap that no one involved would ever forget. At the ruined Ota house, they used the coffin of the bear's own victim as bait, and snipers lay in ambush through the freezing night. The bear came, close enough to be seen, a shadow against the snow. Then it slipped back into the trees before a clean shot could be taken. The trap had failed. On December 13th, as if to mock the siege, the animal wandered through the emptied hamlet and ransacked the abandoned houses one by one, eating stored food, while 600 men searched the hills for it. The turning point arrived on foot, alone. Yamamoto Heikichi was 57 years old, a legendary local hunter who was said to have killed dozens of bears in his lifetime. He knew this particular animal. He had tracked it before. He called it Kesagake, the sash, for the dark marking that draped across its shoulder like a monk's robe. On the morning of December 14th, with a young guide, Yamamoto followed fresh tracks up a slope above the creek. Around 10 o'clock, he saw it, the giant, resting near a bare elm tree in the snow. He closed the distance to 20 meters. No cover, no second chance. The first bullet struck the heart. The bear rose. The second struck the head. It was over. The animal they hauled out of the hills weighed around 340 kilograms and measured nearly 2.7 meters. When it was butchered, human remains were found in its stomach. 6 days, 7 victims, 2 bullets. The survivors gathered to see the body of the thing that had destroyed their world, and even dead witnesses said it was terrifying. On the night after the bear died, the weather itself seemed to turn. A ferocious blizzard swept down the valley, a storm so violent that the settlers gave it a name, the Kuma Arashi, the bear storm. Some whispered that it was the animal's spirit raging at the men who had killed it. The superstition tells you everything about the state of the survivors. They had won, and it did not feel like winning. Within a few years, the hamlet at Rokusensawa was abandoned entirely. The cleared fields returned to forest. For decades, the site of Japan's worst animal attack was a ghost valley, marked by nothing at all. But the story refused to disappear because the people who lived it refused to let it. A boy named Okawa Haruyoshi was the son of a village leader at the time of the attacks. Standing before the victims' graves, he made a vow. For every person the bear had taken, he would kill 10 bears. He kept that vow. By the age of 62, Okawa had shot 102 bears. And in 1977, he erected a memorial near the site, not only to the dead, but to the tragedy that bound humans and bears together. Around the same time, the full truth of the incident was finally rescued from memory. A forestry officer named Kimura Moritake, stationed in the area, realized in 1961 that the last surviving witnesses were growing old. He spent years interviewing more than 30 of them, cross-checking every detail, and published the definitive record of the incident. His work inspired the novelist Yoshimura Akira, whose 1977 documentary novel, Kuma Arashi, made the story famous across Japan. And in 1990, local residents rebuilt a settler cabin at the actual site, watched over by a towering statue of the bear. Visitors who make the long drive today describe the reconstruction as one of the most unsettling places in Hokkaido. More than a century later, the question that lingers is not what happened. Kimura's interviews settled that. The question is why? Why did one bear behave in a way so far outside anything Japan had recorded before or since? 3 explanations have been offered over the years. Each explains part of the horror. None on its own explains all of it. The first is starvation, the denless bear. The attacks came in December, when a healthy bear should have been hibernating. An animal that entered winter without enough fat would have been awake, desperate,
and drawn to the smell of stored crops. This explains the timing and the first raids on corn, but hunger alone does not explain why the bear ignored livestock and returned again and again, specifically for people. The second explanation is habitat pressure. The settlers themselves had transformed the valley, logging the forest for landfill and fuel, shrinking the food range the bear depended on. On this reading, the tragedy was set in motion years earlier by the collision between the frontier and the wilderness. It explains why a bear was pressed so close to human homes, but thousands of settlements faced the same collision and produced nothing like these 6 days. The third explanation is the darkest: learned behavior. The same bear was suspected in earlier fatal attacks on women in a neighboring district. By December 9th, it had killed, fed on a victim, and cached her body, and from that point, its choices looked chillingly consistent. It broke into houses rather than face armed men. Nearly all of its victims were women and children. It returned to the wake where its victim lay. This explains the pattern that makes the case infamous. What it cannot explain is how it began. Put the three together, though, and a timeline emerges that is more disturbing than any single theory. A frontier shrinks a bear's world. A failed autumn empties its stomach. A first, perhaps accidental, encounter with human prey teaches it something no bear should learn: that the cabins were not dens of rivals, but stores of food that could not fight back. Seen this way, the incident was not a freak event. It was an escalation, step by step, from stolen corn to a funeral invaded, with a fatal misunderstanding at its center: the belief that a wounded bear never returns. The people of the valley were not careless. They were following the best knowledge of their time. It simply happened to be wrong. What do you think? Was this tragedy preventable, or was it by 1915 already inevitable?
Today, the valley is quiet again. The forest has taken back the fields. At the reconstruction site, a cabin of logs and straw stands in a clearing, and the statue of an enormous bear looms at the tree line, frozen mid-stride. Japan has never seen another attack like it, but the uneasy border between humans and bears has not gone away. In recent years, bear encounters across Japan have surged to record levels, and each autumn the old questions return. Whose land is this, and what happens when hunger crosses the line? More than 100 years ago, one starving giant crossed it, and a village on the edge of the wild paid the price. The graves are still there, above the creek. So is the memory, preserved by a hunter's vow, a chronicler's interviews, and a community that refused to forget. 7 names, 8 counting the child who was never born. The valley remembers them all.